How many people here watch Mad Men? I think a few of you have watched it. Well, we have the distinct pleasure today of having a true madman in our class. I've known Bobby now for 5 years probably. I met him through a mutual friend, and we spent the first time that we had lunch together talking about the past. I thoroughly enjoyed some of the stories he had to tell about the advertising business, and I think you guys will too. So I think you're going to find him very, very interesting, funny, entertaining, and I think you're going to be glad you were here today. So without further ado, this is Bobby Phillips.
Thank you, and thank you, Professor Hall. Well, good morning, everyone. You're a good-looking group. You make me wish I were young again. And you know, when you're my age, you start thinking about the hereafter. You wander into a room and you wonder, what am I here after? Well, I know why I'm here. I'm here to share with you a little advertising knowledge you don't get in college. Now, Mark Twain said it best. He said, don't let schooling interfere with your education. Now, we're going to talk about that in a minute, but first let me say it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here and look around and see all your bright young faces, because I know I'm looking at the future of advertising. Now, you may be looking at me as the past of advertising, but I've got news for you. I'm still doing it. I still have some clients that I've had for over a half a century. Now, do you know what it takes to keep a client happy for more than 50 years? Well, if you're lucky enough to be related to the client, I guess you could do that through nepotism, or you could do it creatively through imagination. Now, Albert Einstein said imagination is more important than knowledge. Logic will get you from A to B, but imagination will take you everywhere. Hey, it took us to the moon. I mean, think about it. All of the game-changing breakthroughs actually started with imagination. Now, do you remember when you were a kid and you had a lot of imagination then when you played with your dolls, your BB guns, and your toy soldiers, and especially when you wrote your letters to Santa Claus? Well, somewhere along the way, growing up in the real world, we start to lose our imagination. And there's a reason for that. From childhood, we're all taught what to think. Now, that's all good, but nobody can teach you how to think. You have to do that yourself. That's where imagination and creativity come from. I just wrote a book about that called Street Smart. And in this book, you're going to find some amazing stories about advertising. But my favorite story has nothing to do with advertising. It's about my brother who went to school here at SMU. Now, this is a remarkable story, and it's hard to believe, and that's why we call it Admission Impossible. After graduating from high school, my brother worked at a minimum wage job for a while, and then suddenly decided he wanted to go to college. But not just any college. He wanted to go to SMU, just like you. But there was a problem. He didn't have a very good transcript, and he lacked, many of the required subjects. So the dean here suggested maybe he go to night school or a community college. But my brother was determined to go to SMU. So on his own, he began to study with laser-like focus to learn everything he could about all of those required subjects he didn't take in high school. All he did was study and cram for 3.5 years, and then he started bugging that dean to give him an entrance exam. Well, of course, the dean had to say no. But my brother was persistent. He kept calling that dean, writing him letters, and even going to his office. And finally, the exasperated dean said, "Look, Barney," he said, "look, if you promise to stop calling me and never write me another letter or come to my office, we'll give you an entrance exam, okay?" Well, he aced that exam, and the rest is history. He graduated with honors at the top of his class. He was in the National Honor Fraternity. He won the Blue Key. He was who's who in American colleges, and he received the highest honor SMU can give a student, the coveted M Award. And to top it all off, Harvard offered him a scholarship to come up to Cambridge and take his MBA. But before he could do that, sadly and tragically, he was diagnosed with an incurable autoimmune disease, and he died when he was only 27. But I know my brother is up there somewhere right now, and he's smiling because I'm here at SMU, where he spent the happiest days of his life. And speaking of happier days, how many of you have seen Mad Men? Almost everybody. Well, it's a series about advertising in the 60s. Well, being a madman myself from that era, I do have one thing in common with that lead character, Don Draper, who plays the creative director. Now, I'll give you a hint. It's not smoking, it's not drinking, and it's not wild casual sex. They just put all that stuff in there to boost the ratings, you know. But the one thing Don Draper and I do have in common is that neither of us ever planned on an advertising career. We just kind of stumbled into it. Now, as a kid growing up, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I just knew that someday I wanted to be somebody. I guess I should have been more specific because I've been a lot of different things. When I was just a teenager, Uncle Sam drafted me for the Korean War, and my armored infantry battalion was just about to ship out overseas to go fight in Korea. But guess what I did? I entered and won the All-Army Singing Contest. Everyone was astonished because I'd had no musical training at all. Well, nobody could believe it, and that's because nobody had ever heard me sing before. Not even my mother. And I remember calling her from New York, and I said, "Hey, Mom, I'm in New York." And she said, "New York? What the hell are you doing in New York? I thought you were at Fort Hood, Texas in basic training. You didn't go AWOL, did you?" And I said, "No, Mom." I said, "I'm going to be on television." She said, "Television? Doing what?" Well, she thought I must be one of those, precision drill crack platoon soldiers that twirl and toss their rifles around each other. Well, when I came out singing, backed by a 32-piece orchestra, she was blown away. And lucky me, just like Elvis Presley, I was able to trade in my M1 rifle for a microphone. And I didn't have to go to Korea. Well, after the Army, I served as a musical host on a show called Magazine. And one day an agent from New York called and said, "Hey, I heard you sing. How would you like to audition for Your Hit Parade?" And at the time, that was the #1 show on television. And I said, "Yeah, man, sure, absolutely." He said, "Hold it, wait a minute. There is one prerequisite. You do sight read music, don't you?" I said, "No problem." Well, the fact remains, to this day, I still don't know an A flat from a B minor, but that didn't stop me from singing on Your Hit Parade and performing with some of the greatest big bands and in some of the finest, fanciest supper clubs. Now, that's because everybody just naturally assumed I was a trained professional vocalist. So I had to fake it until I could make it because I was learning on the job. Now, things were going just great until Elvis Presley and the Beatles came along and spoiled all the fun. That was when rock and roll and Motown completely took over the music business. And I had to reinvent myself. Well, as luck would have it, I met a guy on the subway who had just graduated from the New York Institute of Photography. And he was really excited about photography, and I thought to myself, you know, Self, that might be a good career for you. So I got him to teach me all about photography, cameras, lenses, filters, film, lighting, all that stuff. And a few months later, I knew enough about f-stops and aperture openings to open my own studio, 7 Art Studios, right in the heart of Manhattan on Madison Avenue. And it didn't take long for some of my photographs to start appearing in national publications. And I even did a little photography for the Associated Press. And some of my more creative work was featured in U.S. Camera. Well, from that point on, I did most of the photography for all of my clients. But I don't do a lot of photography now. I do it mostly just for fun. Now, another thing I did just for fun was write mystery stories. And I'm here to tell you, I'd never even read a mystery story, but I used to amuse myself by coming up with wild, crazy, bizarre plots, like the old doctor who killed his young wife with a sun lamp. And I call that one The Deadly Tan. Well, that whodunit, along with a few others, were published and well received. And Mystery Digest put my mugshot on their cover. Now, you'll notice I'm holding a cigarette. Well, the funny thing is, I don't smoke. But they insisted I hold a cigarette because they said, we want you to look more like a mystery writer. Well, an even funnier thing happened. After they made me a member of the Mystery Writers Guild, they invited me to the annual Mystery Writers Ball. And they introduced me to Agatha Christie. And I'm embarrassed to tell you, at the time, I didn't even know who she was. I knew, though, that I was out of my league as a mystery writer, and I thought, well, you know, it's time that I found another fun way to make a living. Well, back in high school, I played football, and I learned quite a lot about the game. And 22 years later, I came up with a great idea for a football game, Coach's All-Star Football. Now, it must have been a pretty good game because 4 Hall of Fame coaches endorsed the game, and we sold over 200,000 of those games at $14.95 each. And then computer games hit the market, and my game was over. So it was back to the drawing board. Well, I'm not a pilot, but I started a flying magazine for pilots called Aviation News Illustrated. And it started out as a family project. That little guy up there is my son Barney. I named him after my brother. That pretty lady is his mother. And of course, the dude there in the middle, that's yours truly. Well, the magazine really took off, did quite well, but it involved just way too much travel. I didn't want to do that, so a couple of years later, I sold it for a nice profit. Now, this next adventure, this is the most fun I ever had. I thought I might try my hand at writing some of those catchy advertising jingles. Now, remember, I don't read music, so I had to sing all of my lyrics and melodies into a tape recorder so that musicians and singers could follow. Well, I did over 100 jingles in this manner, and 4 of them were first-place national award winners. Anybody who listened to the radio from the 60s to the 90s is bound to have heard some of these jingles. Now, I know you're too young to have heard these jingles, but if you'd like to, they're on my website, streetsmartpublications.com. Now, the reason I'm telling you about all these different things I did with no previous training or experience whatsoever is I want to make a very important point right here, right now. Just because you've never done something before doesn't mean you can't. Now, I'm going to encourage you to try a few new things, take a few risks, have a little fun. Wayne Gretzky, the greatest hockey player of all time, said, "You miss 100% of the shots you don't take." And my personal philosophy has always been positive possibilities are better than negative nothings. So don't be afraid to try new things. Sure, you're going to make some mistakes, but that's how you learn. Well, anyway, after having done all those different things, it occurred to me, maybe I could put all of those creative eggs into one basket, advertising. There was just one problem. I didn't know anything about advertising, media, marketing, cost per thousands, all that stuff. And Professor Hall wasn't around at that time to teach me. So I thought, the best way to learn about advertising is to take a job with an advertising agency as an unpaid intern. Well, I applied to every advertising agency in Dallas and Fort Worth. But nobody wanted me, not even for free. And looking back, I can understand why. I had no college. I'd never had a real job. And when they asked me for my resume, I just, wow. So no wonder they kept pushing those trapdoor buttons to make me disappear. I felt just like that comedian Rodney Dangerfield. He used to say, "I'll tell you, I get no respect." Well, what do you do when all of the doors to advertising are slammed shut in your face? Well, I decided, to hell with it. I'm going to start my own ad agency. So, $15 worth of business cards later, I was in the advertising business. Now, of course, I didn't have any accounts. I didn't even have any prospects for accounts. But I had that one thing going for me, imagination. And remember, that's where all game-changing breakthroughs come from. Again, Albert Einstein said, "I never made one of my discoveries through the process of rational thinking." Well, I did have one rational thought, and that was, I've got to find somebody to teach me about advertising. Well, finally, I found the perfect teacher on the golf course. He was an elderly gentleman who had just retired from a huge full-service advertising agency, and he had an advertising and marketing degree and an awesome resume. So I approached him, introduced myself, and I said, "How would you like to make some money for doing nothing?" Well, he laughed, and I went on to explain my dilemma. And I said, "Seriously, if you'll teach me a little about advertising, we can do it at your convenience, won't interfere with anything else you're doing, and I'll pay you big bucks." He said, "Hey man, you got yourself a deal." So we shook hands, and I made him my absentee president. Well, guess who I named the chairman of the board? I named my dog chairman of the board, seriously. I didn't want a title of any kind for obvious reasons. It worked so much better for me to do all the work and give all of the credit to my president, who had that fabulous resume. Now, this worked even better than I expected, because after a few weeks, I landed my first major account, Runaway Bay. This is really sweet because I took that account away from one of those agencies that just a few weeks earlier rejected me. So when they found out that some guy named Bobby Phillips had stolen one of their accounts, they began to ask around, well, who is this guy, Bobby Phillips? Well, I wasn't in the ad league. I wasn't even in the phone book, and nobody in the media had ever heard of me. I was sort of like Cotton Eye Joe, you know. Where did he come from? Where did he go? From that point on, our agency started growing by leaps and bounds. And soon, our billing was in the millions. And we kept moving to larger and larger offices until finally we bought our own building, sort of like Stan Richards. Anyway, all that time, we kind of kept to ourselves. We were almost top secret. We didn't join any advertising clubs or produce any agency brochures, none of that, because we didn't want our competition to know what we were doing or how we were doing it. Turns out, we were playing chess while they were playing checkers. You'll notice up there we had quite a few radio and television accounts, and there's a reason for that. We never bought airtime strictly based on ratings, and back in the 60s, it was all about ratings. But we looked at demographics and psychographics and all that stuff, and these broadcasters wanted us to show them how to sell agencies like us who didn't buy strictly based on ratings. Now, let me tell you a funny story about ratings. Back in the 60s, there was no all-night television. Precisely at midnight, the bewitching hour, all of the TV stations signed off the air. That was it. So in a meeting with one of my clients, WFAA Television, Channel 8 here in Dallas, I said, hey, why don't we run some all-night movies to capture that huge, untapped, nocturnal audience out there, you know, who would probably watch anything. I mean, we've got tens of thousands of night owls and, you know, night shift workers and insomniacs who would probably watch anything that was on. Well, they said, well, you know, Bobby, you know perfectly well we can't sell any programming that's not supported by ratings. And I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I said, if you will get me the cheapest B movies you can find, like Charlie Chan and Godzilla Meets the Wolfman, and give me the absolute lowest possible rates, I'll buy 13 weeks of all-night television. Well, they said, do you have any advertisers? And I said, no. And they said, you mean you're willing to risk $30,000 to $40,000 on programming that has no ratings and you have no advertisers? And I said, yes. Well, they knew I was a madman, but there was a method to my madness. I had a fail-safe strategy that I was sure would work. Let me tell you what I did. On the first night of my all-night movies, I ran dozens of commercials for my various clients, but I didn't tell them their commercials were running. No, I kept it a secret. They had no idea. They didn't know their commercials were running all night long until the next morning when all of these red-eyed customers started showing up in droves to buy whatever they were selling. Well, these clients started calling me. And they said, hey, what's going on? They were thrilled with the results, by the way. And I said, hey, you took a free ride on those commercials. We're not going to charge you for those spots. That was only a test. Well, they were so ecstatic, so thrilled with the results, that before the day was out, I sold out my entire 13 weeks of all-night movies. And of course, all the other TV stations, they followed our overnight success. But folks, that is how I started all-night television. Now, there are some other firsts in my book, Street Smart, and how I happened to come up with the first frequent flyer program for airlines back in the 60s, and also a revolutionary marketing program for Mercedes-Benz that forever changed the way we buy automobiles. Now, these and other stories are in the book, Street Smart. We're going to tell you how you can get a free copy of that. But I think we're about out of time now. So I'd like to close and leave you with this thought. Use your imagination and don't let anyone, I mean anyone, set your limitations. Well, that's it, and you've been a terrific audience. Any questions, anybody? Yes.
This prompted a lively and engaging 20-minute question and answer session, as Bobby answered logical questions with creative examples.
Thank you. Have a fantastic career.
Thank you, Bobby.
Street Smart is now available through Amazon, Apple, Barnes & Noble, or StreetSmartPublications.com.